Well, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Rachel and I'm a marketing coordinator here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com or by following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. In the coming weeks, we're looking forward to welcoming Lee Vandervoo in conversation with Isaac Vergun on October 2nd to discuss her book, As the World Burns. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Sarah Mirk, Omar El Akkad, Kane Lynch, and Hazel Newlevant. Sarah Mirk is a graphic journalist whose work centers on politics, history, and identity. She writes and edits nonfiction comics for The Nib and is a web producer for the Center for Investigative Reporting. Previously, she worked as an editor at the feminist nonprofit Bitch Media. She lives in Portland, Oregon. In Guantánamo Voices, True Accounts from the World's Most Infamous Prison, journalist Sarah Mirk tells the stories of 10 different people who have been inside Guantanamo, including military personnel, prisoners, lawyers, and journalists. Omar El Akkad, writer of the foreword for Guantánamo Voices, was born in Egypt, grew up in Qatar, moved to Canada as a teenager, and now lives in the United States. The start of his journalism career coincided with the start of the War on Terror, and over the following decade, he reported on Afghanistan, Guantánamo Bay, and many other locations around the world. Omar lives in the woods just south of Portland, Oregon. Hazel Newlevant, a Guantánamo Voices contributor, is a Portland-raised, Queens-residing cartoonist whose comics include No Ivy League, Sugartown, If This Be Sin, and Tenderhearted. They have edited and published the anthologies Chainmail, Bikini, and Comics for Choice. Their work as a cartoonist and editor has been honored with the Ignatz Award, the Eisner Award, and the Prism for Comics Queer Press Grant. Kane Lynch, also a Guantánamo Voices contributor, is a cartoonist in Portland whose comics and illustrations have appeared in publications including Slate, The Nib, and Psychology Today. This evening's event will also include a Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. If someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please consider upvoting that particular question. And most importantly, please consider supporting tonight's authors and Powell's by purchasing a copy of their book. A link to the Guantánamo Voices will be shared in the chat a few times this evening. And without any further ado, please welcome Sarah, Omar, Hazel, and Kane.
Hey, thank you so much for that introduction. Yay! And it's so nice to see everyone's names on the participants list. I know most of you and am related to some of you, so thanks for attending. Ooh, that was my door slamming in the wind. I'm going to share my screen, and we have a little presentation for you that we're going to talk about the process of making the book and reporting on Guantánamo Bay. Yeah, let's just get started. I'm going to talk first, and then I'm going to talk to Omar about the process of reporting the story, and then we're going to hear from Hazel and then Kane about making the book. And like Rachel said, if you have any questions, drop them in that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And yeah, here's the book itself. It's beautiful. I can't believe it's real because I've been wanting to make it for 10 years, so now it's here. Okay, cool. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully we don't have any tech problems. Fingers crossed. Okay, cool. Yeah, the first, the book is a collection of various different stories from people who have spent time at Guantánamo Bay, and each story is illustrated by a different artist. So this is actually pretty innovative for the world of comics journalism. I don't know another book that's written this way. That's like where there's one person who's written the story, but where it's illustrated by a bunch of different artists collaborating together. And I really wanted to collaborate on this book rather than having it just come from my voice. I got interested in Guantánamo about 10 years ago. In 2008, I met this person, Chris Arendt, who was seen here playing the ukulele on Brighton Beach in England. And we met here in Portland at the Independent Publishing Resource Center, which is a place, it's a collective studio space for making zines and comics. And I was there making a zine, and I looked over and Chris was making a zine, and I didn't know them, but I just said, hey, what's that? What are you working on? And they said, oh, I'm making a zine about my time as a guard at Guantánamo Bay. And I was like, what? That's wild. I can't believe that. And at the time, Guantánamo for me was not, didn't really seem like a real place full of real people. It was just kind of like a word that I'd seen in headlines. And so talking to Chris about it really kind of blew my mind and made me think about the place. And then Chris was invited to go on a speaking tour through England with a bunch of former prisoners of Guantánamo Bay. And this was my vision of what they would be like at the beginning of the tour. Just have this one image in my mind of the prison. But actually, the people who have been imprisoned in Guantánamo Bay come from all different walks of life in many different countries. Here on the left-hand side of the screen is a man named Jarla Almari and Chris at Al Jazeera during that tour. And on the right is Mozambique, who's in the book. And so when I heard that Chris was going on this tour around England with these former Guantanamo prisoners, I was like, wow, that seems like a really incredible story to tell. Can I come with you? And so I went with them on the trip. They said, yes, I could come along. And I traveled with them and kept a blog of the trip called Guantánamo Voices. This is the group that organized it, called Cage. And this is the blog with my really wonderful 2008 graphic design skills. I really just threw it together because I felt like I had to document what was happening, and I just did it really quickly. Just back when Wordles were big. Remember those like word clouds? Those were big at the time. But so I kept this blog of the trip, and I always wanted to make more of it when I came back, like do some bigger project with it. But I didn't really know what to do or how to do it. I didn't know anybody who'd written a book. I didn't have any skills for that. I saw it as a graphic novel, and these are sketches from my sketchbook at the time where I was thinking about like, okay, here are some scenes that could be in the book. So this is from my sketchbook in 2009. And as you can see, I've got a long way to go. My drawing skills have gotten a lot better since then, but you can kind of see that I'm thinking of like, oh, I want to capture this as a visual story here, because I think that the visual components are so strong. And also I see comics as a way to build empathy with readers. You know, because someone's face is drawn and you can see what they're wearing and where they are, that builds a lot of empathy between the subject of the story and the reader. And it's also a way to get around censorship here, because photos and access to Guantánamo is so tightly controlled. Comics can do a great blending of like the photo materials that you do have can be the reference points, but then you can use those as the basis for filling in the gaps as an artist. And yeah, here's some more of those drawings from 2009. So this was like where it started. And it's a little embarrassing showing these, but I want to say, you know, it's come a long way. And then a few years later, I was contacted by another veteran who had served at Guantánamo named Laura Sandow, who was interested in like somehow processing her experience working on the base. And we talked about it and decided to make a comic about where I would interview her about her experiences, and then she and I together would interview another female veteran. And this was published in a comics magazine called Symbolia, which is no longer around, but it was reprinted at Narratively. And this is illustrated by the artist Lucy Bellwood, who's extremely talented. And looking back on this project, I was just like, I really felt like this project was one of the best journalistic projects I'd ever did. Like, it had a strong impact. Like, people read it and actually understood it and cared about it. And then I just felt like, oh, we took sort of this really messy, complicated place and experiences, and we're able to turn them into a narrative that really resonated with people emotionally. And so using these, I was able to see those as like a jumping off point for like, okay, if we can tell one story this way, can we tell 10 stories this way? And can we shed like light on the prison from these various perspectives to sort of say, how did we ever get here? And what happens now? So yeah, so I pitched a book on this. After Trump was elected, I really like got motivated to say, hey, we need to keep talking about Guantánamo and to really try and change the cultural narrative and stories that we tell about Guantánamo. Because Trump said he would keep it open for as long as possible and possibly send more people there. So I really felt motivated to like, now is the time to change our understanding of this place. And I had, now after like 10 years, I had gained a lot more skills at telling nonfiction comic stories. I worked as an editor at the Nib, which publishes political comics and nonfiction comics. Today, they just published an excerpt from the book on the site. So I was working there. So I had now experience working with artists on telling nonfiction stories, writing nonfiction comics myself, and had a lot more skills in order to put this together. And I had met a bunch of artists who were really great who I could recruit for this project. To do this project, I interviewed a whole bunch of people. This is the only photo I took of myself during this process, but and you can see it, and like, it's not like a happy process. It was pretty time consuming and taxing, and my cat kept me company. And so I interviewed a bunch of people about what they'd experienced at the prison, and then took those interviews and turned them into scripts for the comic. I also read pretty much every book there is about Guantanamo, to try and be like, okay, what are the through lines here? What are the stories that feel most important to tell, and what's misunderstood? And then I actually went to the prison. So last year in April, I applied and then was approved to go and tour the prison. This doesn't happen very often. The military only does a few tours of the prison for media, and even then it's pretty tightly controlled. So I was able to go. It's a 3-day tour, and it's like a very curated, PR-focused mission. So you don't get to actually talk to any of the prisoners. Journalists can't talk to anybody who's incarcerated there. But I got to go and take a bunch of photos. So when I'm thinking about writing a comic, I take as many photos as possible because I want artists to be able to have them as reference for their work in the future. And so I'm trying to get like scenes that I think artists will put into the comic. I'm trying to, as I'm reporting, I'm like, okay, what do we need to document here? So here's a picture of Camp XRay, that iconic photo that you saw from 2002 of the prisoners in orange jumpsuits behind barbed wire. This is what that place looks like now. It's really overgrown and is slated to be torn down, which for me is like emblematic of how we want to just forget about this place, even while there's still 40 people who are incarcerated there. And so as I'm drawing this, I'm thinking in my head, okay, how is this going to be a scene in a comic? You know, what sort of details do I need to put into the comic? And some of them are very clear. So this is journalists coming off the plane. I know that, like, okay, I should try and make sure that we can get this kind of accurate in the comic. Everything that we can, let's have be accurate. And comics is not a photojournalistic medium, so things aren't like, don't look just exactly like they do in real life. That's not the point. But to use as much as we can from real life as a jumping off point for artists to draw these stories from. This is the library at the prison. And so I wanted to get all these details to try and humanize the people who are there as much as possible. The men who are incarcerated in Guantanamo, over time, there's been 779 people at the prison. 778 of them are Muslim men. And they've been really thoroughly dehumanized by our government and stigmatized and labeled every bad word you can think of in the dictionary. So I wanted to try and get like any details that I could of their humanity. What books are they interested in? What are they reading? And then also just like, what is life like on the base? This is a photo of a trail sign. You know, there's about over 7,000 people that live on the base, both civilians and military. So it's kind of like a small town. It's like a small American town. So there's all these aspects that feel really surreal to be like, oh, there's a McDonald's at Guantanamo. This is my plane ticket because I want those kind of details in there too. But then I have other weird details that jump out to me. Like this is the coffee in the dining hall. It's called Jamaican Me Crazy and Valor Blend. And so I know that in those, I don't even know if this will wind up in the final comic, but I want to try and get those details that provide like life on the base, as well as any kind of humanizing details that I can. People's uniforms, etc. There's also weirdly a gift shop at Guantanamo. Like on any naval base, there's a naval exchange where you can buy stuff that's branded with the base, and Guantanamo just feels more out of step. Really weird stuff. But it's kind of in line with like the government's vision of this place as being a safe, humane, and legal prison that's like, we shouldn't be upset about at all. And I see the gift shop as being emblematic of that. Also during my time there was an escape room at the library. So these are all the details that I'm trying to collect as a journalist to be like, wow, this is weirder than I could ever make up. We've got to get this into the comic. I left my mark there. Can you find the sticker that I left? It's right in the middle. This is what a comic script looks like. So I take all that information, I take the interviews I did, all the books I read, all the photos I've taken, and I write a script for the comics, which look just like a movie script. As you can see here, we've got like panel 1, suggested image, and on and on. And this is what I give to the artists for them to work from. So there's a lot of choices they can make with this. You know, in my mind, I see it one way, but I try to work really collaboratively with artists for them to take what I've written and make it their own. And then I also gave the artists a color palette to work from. So because there's 12 different artists in this book, I wanted to have a color be a unifying through line. And the colors here are really surprising. I asked for a sunset tones color palette, and the artist Casimir Lee developed this. I wanted the sunset tones for a bunch of reasons. One is that the topic of the book is so dark and heavy that I wanted colors that would bring a lightness to it and make it feel more accessible. I also wanted it to feel surprising, where when most books about Guantanamo are kind of in a color palette of like black, gray, and orange. So I wanted something that immediately drew people in, that people would say like, oh, this is different, this is interesting, this is strange, I'm not sure what to expect, and would therefore pick up the book. And then also Guantanamo itself is like full of these sunset colors. I mean, it's on the island of Cuba, it's in the Caribbean, so we've got like the sky, the ocean, are these beautiful colors that really contrast with the horror of the place. And so I wanted that color palette to be a unifying through line through the book. Also kind of an innovative method there. That's a weird thing for a book to do, but I think it worked out. And as you can see here, this is like a final page from the book, and it's taken my script and they've actually put it on the page with those colors, and here's what it looks like. Okay, I'll talk to Omar. Hi, Omar. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Let's just go to talking to you. Okay, so I was hoping you could talk to me a little bit about your journey to reporting on Guantanamo. You wrote such a beautiful, beautiful introduction to this book, which I just feel like says everything I would possibly want to say about this place. And the main thing that you really hit on that is really striking to me is that you talk about how like Americans especially want to let Guantanamo sink into our distant memory. And this book, you saw it as an antidote to forgetting. So can you talk a little bit about like how you think Americans just want this place to like not exist in our mind and disappear, and how we can fight back against that?
Sure, yeah. First off, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, both this project and this event. It really is a spectacular piece of work. In 2008, the first year that you started becoming interested in this project was also the first year that I ended up going to Guantanamo. I was working for the Globe and Mail, Canada's national paper at the time. And at the time, the last Westerner still held in Guantánamo Bay was this kid named Omar Khadr. Omar Khadr is a Canadian citizen. His father was basically bin Laden's CFO. He was the money guy for Al Qaeda, and clearly involved in some really horrible stuff. The kid was 15 when he was caught after a firefight in a compound in Afghanistan. He had a piece of shrapnel in his eye, and he was accused of throwing the grenade that killed a special forces medic. One medic died, the other medic saved his life. And Khadr spent the next 10 years of his life in Gitmo, awaiting trial. And because he was Canadian, Canadian media was interested. Had he not been there, I would have never been sent. It would not have been relevant, the same way that all Canadian media, or the vast majority of Canadian media, pulled their reporters out of Afghanistan when the Canadian military involvement came to an end. And the reason I bring this up is because there is that whole sort of, there's blinders on in terms of coverage at an institutional level. And this is not a Canadian thing, it's not an American thing, it is universal across mainstream news media. What is the local angle? So that's how I got sent there. And so, I was 20 something, I was very, very scared. And when I'm nervous, I do the worst possible thing, which is I try to make jokes. So I'm on the phone with the DOD guy, the Pentagon dude who has to clear me. And he's telling me all the things, you have to give them your birth certificate and all this stuff, right? And at one point I make this joke about how I must be the first guy named Omar who's going to Gitmo willingly. And that joke goes over about as well as you would expect.
Is it just like silence, or is he like, that's not funny, sir?
Just 3.5 seconds to 15 minutes of silence. And then followed by, actually we have a lot of reporters from Muslim countries and, like the spiel, right? Anyway, you get there, and what you get very quickly is the intersection of time and the intersection of language. So one of the defining memories I have from my first trip to Gitmo was we were touring Camp 4, which is the medium security prison. There used to be camps 1, 2, and 3. A bunch of people killed themselves there. They shut down 1, 2, and 3, made 4, 5, and 6. 4 is medium security, 5 and 6 are supermax facilities, and Camp 7 is the secret supermax facility that we only found out about by accident because they forgot to black it out on one of the censored court documents. And 7 is where they keep the 9/11 guys, the high value. Nobody's ever seen 7 outside of the military. We've never been allowed. We only know about it by accident. But 4 is medium. So there's communal living. You get compliance items. If you're compliant, you get things like nightshades. You get toothpaste. You get to see other people. So we're touring 4, and I ask the guy the officer who's giving us the tour. I say something like, "So when do the prisoners?" And as soon as I get to the word prisoners, one of the soldiers stops me and says, "We don't have prisoners here, sir. We have detainees." And it was vitally important to the entire enterprise that there be no prisoners in Guantánamo Bay, because prisoner implies a prison sentence which must be defined. A detainee you can hold forever. And so you quickly found out that on top of the overt violence of locking people in these cages that are, essentially the size of a bathroom in a house. And on top of that overt violence, you had a linguistic violence. There were no interrogations in Guantánamo Bay. Of course there were brutal interrogations left, right, and center, but they were never called that. They were called reservations, as in detainee 862 has an 8:30 p.m. reservation tonight. That means they're about to be taken to the shack and interrogated. So you had euphemistic violence, linguistic violence, all on top of this bedrock of the actual violence. It was all sort of holding itself up. And then you had this kind of cycle of time. We talk about Guantánamo as the basis for a lot of what we see in the mainland right now, in particular things like the internment camps for immigrant children that are along the southern border right now. And so it's this idea of casting Guantánamo forward. But Guantánamo is not the beginning of that continuum. The supermax facilities in Guantánamo Bay were built on the blueprints of supermax facilities from the continental US. They took those blueprints, they recreated them in Gitmo, and then they took the Gitmo model and they recreated for these kids. And so you see that continuum, and that for me was, those two things were the most terrifying of getting to know Guantánamo, was the amount of institutional fantasy that was holding all of this up, and the extent to which it was not an anomaly. It was along a continuum, and it was happening again and again in different costumes.
Yeah, it was really important to me in this book to say that this is a prison and the people in there are prisoners, which is contrary to what the government says. It's officially like a detainment camp and these are detainees. And I think that language choice is important. So in your reporting on Guantánamo, do you find yourself like having to like unlearn the sort of like government speak around this and be like, oh, okay, there's this PR that's happening, but like what is actually happening here? I can find that a little bit hard to filter out.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I had these conversations with the foreign editor at the Globe, where we'd go back and forth. I mean, one of the things that newspapers do, for example, nobody's a murderer until they're convicted in a court of law. Until they're an alleged killer, they're the alleged assailant, blah, blah, blah. You're not a murderer until you've been convicted. And that is a kind of, in a perfect world, that's a great system you have. It standardizes things. In a system where the court system might be compromised, that suddenly becomes a horrible standard to implement. And so, generally speaking, media is an institution, government is an institution. There's a level of institutional trust because these things work in similar ways. And so you want to use the government language. But it's very clear, even more so than usual in this case, that the government language is being used to uphold a fantasy. Something that does not exist. And it was so extreme to the point that the media pack we got, which was this little informational, I mean, it was a piece of tourism. It was not, it was look at all the species of iguana on the island, and look how pretty this is. And it's a little media pack that served almost no purpose. But one of the documents in there was a brief history of Gitmo. 100 years ago, a bunch of Marines landed and they set up tents and then blah, blah, blah. And then you get to whatever, 2003, I guess, or whatever it was. And it says, 2003, the first prisoners arrive in Guantánamo Bay. So even their own people who are writing this stuff are getting it wrong, because their natural inclination is to use the correct word for what they're seeing. But there's an order coming down from somewhere that says, no, 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 you have to use enemy combatant. You have to use unlawful enemy combatant. You have to use detainee. You have to do this. You have to do this, because otherwise this entire thing comes crumbling down. So very quickly we came to the conclusion that we weren't going to parrot this. Very quickly wasn't quickly enough. The first few articles did do that. The first few articles did just use detainee, assuming it was a harmless thing and this is the official language. But eventually you just look at it and you say, well, my own eyes are telling me this. The government is telling me that. I'm going to go ahead and go with my own eyes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then this is kind of like a philosophical question, but so you wrote a book called American War. That's a novel that has a scene that's like, has a setting that's directly inspired by Guantanamo. It's pretty tough to read. And then you wrote the introduction to this book. So like, what good do you think it is to write books about this? Like, how do you think that changing the cultural narrative on this will actually change things in real life? Or why does this kind of work feel important to you?
It's a really good question, and I have a really unsatisfactory
No.
answer. I apologize in advance. So a couple of years ago, after the novel came out, I wrote this novel called American War. It came out in 2017, and a little after that, I got contacted by this traveling cross between a theater troupe and like TED Talks. And they said, we do these multimedia installations, we bring speakers. Would you like to do something? And I said, sure. What are you thinking? And they said, well, you've been sort of a conflict reporter. Do you have anything in that realm? And I said, well, I have a lot of pictures and multimedia from my time in Gitmo. And at the time, George W. Bush was going on Ellen and stuff and was doing the rehabilitation tour. The like, I'm not Donald Trump, look at me, forget everything that happened in the first decade of this century tour. And I said, we should probably remind people of what this was. And they said, oh, well, that was a great idea, but do you have anything more recent? And it became clear what was happening. I mean, almost as a self-defense mechanism, the outrage of right now displaces the outrage of back then. And we're in a situation now where George W. Bush is literally about to publish a book of portraits of immigrants, to show how important they are to the national fabric. The guy who created ICE is now able to do this with a straight face, because we've had to wash that away. And again, I don't blame people at an individual level for not remembering every day when they wake up that Guantanamo is a travesty. I genuinely can't tell you what last week's Trump scandal was. I have already forgotten it. It's been displaced by whatever the hell happened yesterday, and that's going to be displaced by what happens today and tomorrow, and so on and so forth. It's almost an emotional self-defense mechanism to move on. But you can move on. The system doesn't move on. The lessons that are learned in these places at an institutional level are not suddenly forgotten because now there's just 40 people there and most of them are just going to die there and who cares. That stuff gets re-implemented in these internment camps. It gets re-implemented in the language of violence, in the language of declaring every protest a riot so that you can go in and tear gas the hell out of everybody. And all of this, these are lessons that are learned. And what's learned is that this works. This works immediately because it allows us to do what we want in the moment. And everybody's upset and nobody wants to be called a traitor and everybody wants to be called a patriot, so let us get away with it. And it works over time because people will forget about it because it is very unpleasant in hindsight. And if your government takes those two lessons away, they will repeat it over and over again, and the costume will change, but the methodology will not. And so when I talk about this book as an antidote to forgetting, you are at the very least reminding people, this is what actually happened. If you want to go on and forget about it afterwards, fine, but at least these books, which outlive us and sit on a library shelf collecting dust for 100 years after we're dead, will at least remind people that this is what actually happened. And I think if you're in a creative endeavor, that really is the best that you can hope for.
Well, that's really beautifully said, Omar. And I'm going to be thinking about that phrase that the system doesn't forget, and the system keeps learning for a long time. I want to have the artists share some of their work, so I think we're going to move on to Hazel. And like I said, Omar, if you need to go flee and feed a baby or wash some laundry, please feel free to. So thanks so much. Okay, and don't forget to drop your questions into the chat. You can ask questions of Omar or me or Hazel, Kane, anybody. So drop them in there. Sorry, not the chat, the Q&A. Hit the Q&A button. Okay, Hazel, you're up.
All right.
Hi, everybody. You sent me some slides.
Stuff, right?
Yeah. We're gonna bring it up in just a second, as soon as I can find it on my computer.
Somehow in sync about showing the slides, but yeah, I did the intro and outro chapters to the book, which cover Sarah's visit to Guantánamo Bay as a journalist. And I was really honored by that. And I also thought that I might have one of the easier jobs, because y'all saw what an amazing job she did taking reference photos. So I had a whole lot to work from. And, you know, I'm sure that a lot of the interviewees didn't have as comprehensive reference for what they were talking about. So I felt like I lucked out in that sense. Anyway, here is how I draw a page. This is the thumbnail dropping in the dialogue from Sarah's script using a font that's based on my hand lettering. And I wanted to start with this one because I actually revised the page layout after trying it out the way it was scripted. Yeah, here you can see the inks, and I consolidated the panels a little bit so that I could have that full width one in the middle to get the sort of vista of journalists getting off the plane. You know, I figured it wasn't too crucial to show a fictional flight attendant. So I consolidated things where I could, just to get fewer panels on the page, more room for art. Yeah.
I like how I look super sleepy in the bottom. I just got off this plane. Okay.
I felt good about drawing that expression too. Yeah, and then I also revised the colors. I actually just counted up when Sarah brought up the color palette. There's, I think, 28 colors, including the dark purple. And different artists use this palette in different ways. But I was very literal about just taking an eyedropper to these colors with no blending, just, yeah, working in this limited palette. And that was an interesting, it definitely made it look unified, and it was an interesting challenge, you know, trying to convey that Sarah's wearing a black t-shirt without that actually being a color. What combination is going to kind of read like that? So anyway, this was the first page that I colored, because it's the first page, and then I came back to it, and I wanted to show everyone the revision too.
So this is this how it looked in the final version? No, yeah. This is how it looked in the final version.
Yeah, I made the airplane blue, made the shadows on Sarah's face brown. Just switched some colors around so that the planes of distance that I was drawing would become more clear.
So this is how you drew it initially, and then you can see it gets different there. And then we've got one more page, and then we'll show some videos of your process.
Yeah. So I wanted to show the process also of drawing the part of the story that Sarah was talking about earlier, going to the Independent Publishing Resource Center and meeting Chris, which was very exciting for me because I too have printed zines at the IPRC. You know, this was the older location that was right around the corner from Powell's before they moved on to Division. And, you know, I had been there. So, yeah, I'm just thrilled anytime I get to draw Portland, especially around 2008, 2009. And I got the layout for this IPRC that no longer exists from a YouTube tour.
Yeah, I think you did such a great job. I love all the details on this page. I like that you got Chris's tattoos and like the rain on the window. It's just beautiful.
I love drawing rain on windows. I remembered I had to draw the tattoos at the last minute and was like, okay, they gotta be there. All right, is this where it switches over to the process videos?
I think I froze, but maybe I'm back. Yeah, sorry, I froze and now I'm back. Hello again.
Anyway, I drew the whole thing in Procreate on my iPad, which gives me some advantages in terms of showing process because it automatically screen records. So I just wanted to play really fast.
So can you guys see this video on my screen? Just give me a thumbs up if you can.
I can. Can you make it full screen to the window? Yeah, love that. Yeah, just trying to figure out how the panel should go. I put the text in first because I want to make sure that the reading order is going to work. You know, you got to position the figures so that what they're saying can be read in the correct order.
I think this is so cool to see.
Oh, thanks. I'm really happy that I can share this. It's a neat thing to have access to.
Yeah. I like seeing it just kind of show up out of the blue.
Yeah, I wish pages just drew themselves sometimes.
One thing people have asked me about is like how to give feedback on comics like this. Like how did this change from beginning to end? Do you feel like it really, what changed about it for you when you were drawing from beginning to end of drawing it?
Based on feedback from you or based on just
both feedback from me and like what it looked like to you?
I'm not sure. There was one point where I was drawing the prisoners that you were looking at and I drew them with kind of like mild expressions because I was attempting to like show the camaraderie between them, and you were like, they look too happy, which is, you know, extremely fair. And but I'm not sure how much else changed. Anyway, yeah, this is my coloring process. Every time that things are flashing, that's because I'm toggling the visibility of layers and being like, what's on this layer again?
And how long do you think this whole process took you? How long does one page from thumbnails to colors take you, do you think?
That's a good question.
It's kind of sad to break it down by an hourly rate, but like,
I don't know. I would say the thumbnailing takes me 1 to 2 hours because that is the bulk of the, I guess, conceptual work. And then the inking is probably 4 hours and the coloring is probably another 4. Something about that. So that would be 9 to 10 hours per page. That it's not too far off from there.
Yeah, and then for this book, I forget how many pages you did, but it was like 26 pages or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
So that's a lot of hours.
Yeah, for sure. But a good thing about the iPad is that I could draw it at different places, at my girlfriend's house while we were watching TV. Yeah, I drew that Powell's page there.
That's sweet.
So, you know, there's at least some flexibility about it that I don't have to be chained to my drawing table while I'm working on it, but it is definitely time intensive because I want to get it right.
Was there anything else you want to add about your process? or working on this book?
I don't know. That's basically it. That I felt like I got off easy with the amount of reference that you provided me, and the color palette was a fun challenge to work with. But I don't know. It was just really cool to get my copy of the book and see everyone else's comics that are sandwiched between the intro and outro. Like, I'd only read the script, and I don't know, it's really terrific to see everyone else's stories illustrated.
Cool. Well, let's move on to Kane. Hi, Kane. I'm going to share my screen again and show some of your work. Sure.
So for the folks that did not hear this at the beginning, I am on Sarah's back porch because the power is out at my house due to this windstorm. The windstorm is also here, so if you can't hear me well, apologies, and let me know if I need to repeat something.
There's so many disasters all over the place right now. It's like, what's going to shut us down? Is it going to be fire? Is it going to be pandemic? Is it going to be a windstorm? So
Yeah,
None of it.
I hope life on my back porch is good, though.
It is lovely, and having polar seltzer, the you spring for the name brand makes a big difference.
Oh yeah, that's just for you. Well, let's talk about your chapter. I got some slides here, so just tell me when to click.
All right, next slide. So I got to illustrate Mansour Adayfi's story about his relationship with animals on the island while imprisoned, which was a real honor. And, next slide. We originally did this together, Sarah and I, for the NIM magazine, the animals issue. And there was a bit of an adaptation process to get this a little bit longer and to fit the format of the book. Next slide. So this is the version that's in the book. And in this version, it's the last page, this kind of outro image of the prison. Next slide. But in the NIM magazine version, this was the first page. So we have the title and the kind of thesis statement. Next slide. So this was my thumbnail version, and whenever I see thumbnails from someone like Hazel, I am just blown away because my thumbnails are like embarrassingly rough, where I need to write the word iguana on the iguana, so
I love that iguana. It just says iguana.
Yeah, they're feeling very ambivalent about their station in life, which I probably would be if I were an iguana. I was already really relying on your amazing reference photos, but not necessarily worrying about drawing them super accurately. I was trying to get the vibe of this prison in the middle of a field that, even though you're on this island that is beautiful, that you're removed from that. Next slide. And then on the pencil stage, I really looked at those references more closely and tried to get the architecture of the prison right and the biology of the iguana right. Then I think the next slide is where it gets interesting. Because Mansour is actually a really lovely painter, and though before this project I did not know a huge amount about Guantánamo, I was actually familiar with his works because of news coverage of the paintings done by the prisoners there. So I wanted to pay a little bit of tribute to that. I was also a little intimidated because I knew that he was capable of both writing and illustrating his own story, so I hoped I could do him justice. Next slide. So I did, even though most of the comic is digital, I did some real watercolor and gouache to try to get the texture and atmosphere of this environment. So I scanned a texture like this, and then next slide. And then for other panels, I would just do kind of like general textures that aren't necessarily like, when I did this grass, I wasn't intending it for a particular panel. I was just trying to give myself some stock paint textures that I could kind of intersperse throughout the comic.
You paint this by hand and then scan it in, right?
Yeah. And then once we're in the content of the story, this is a page that was, I think, my favorite part. So here's Sarah's script, which was based on a prose piece by Mansour, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he's actually working on a memoir, and so this is like an adaptation from the memoir that he's working on in progress.
Next slide. So then I did a thumbnail version of that, and yeah, this is mostly just trying to figure out the kind of staging. I think what was sort of interesting about this is that it's nonfiction, but there's a lot more of a narrative element than a lot of other kind of journalistic comics I've done, where I really had to figure out how these characters are going to interact with each other in a scene. What does this guy look like when he looks up and sees these rats kind of surreally walking through the barbed wire? Then next slide. And then also I was worried about representing these animals correctly, because I have never seen a banana rat. So I watched a lot of YouTube videos, but then I remembered something that Larry Harris, the other nib editor, said, which was that part of the reason that I was thought of for this story was, in her words, because you draw your cat so fucking much. Excellent.
Did you draw your cat a lot?
I do draw my cat a lot. I stare at her a lot. I draw her a lot. So, you know, I do a fair number of nonfiction comics that are fairly serious. Next slide, please. But I also do a lot of silly comics about me and my cat. And when I'm doing those, I'm not really thinking about the accurate anatomy of a cat. I'm, you know, turning this cat into an anthropomorphic character. And I was thinking about it in the story. That's really what Mansour and the other prisoners are doing with the Houthia. So next slide. So I felt like I could have the poetic license to give the Houthia this little sneaky smile as they're creeping into the prison. And you know, the prisoners literally say they seem like little people. So I felt like that was sort of an appropriate tone. Next slide. So then once I had that all in place, I did my biggest change from the script, even though we had so few panels to get through a lot of material. I just really wanted this one panel of that banana rat just grooming and being a little bit silly. And I feel like that's an important contrast to all this kind of anger that is being projected onto it by humans.
That's a nice element of pacing, I think. You're like, oh, it needs like a little spot of reflection in the story to be like, oh, this is kind of super loud and busy. It's a nice pacing element.
Thank you. Yeah, it's hard when you don't have a lot of room and you have a lot of material to cover, but having those kind of moments of poetry or humor, I think, counts for a lot in telling the story. Yeah, so here's the final colored version where a lot of the atmosphere comes through in that last stage. There's some kind of random painted textures that I added to the banana rats there. Next slide. And yeah, I think this is my favorite moment because it is just so much about what people are projecting onto animals. And you mentioned earlier that comics are a way of kind of extending empathy. And I think this story is very much about who we extend empathy toward, that people who are not being treated as human are extending humanity to creatures that we also don't necessarily respect.
It's beautifully said, yeah. Well, that's the end. That was beautiful. Thanks, Kane. I've got one more surprise to show you guys, which is, so one of the stories is about a lawyer named Shelby Sullivan Bennis, and talking about her client who's still in Guantanamo, whose name is Abdul Latif Nasser. And you can't actually talk to anybody in Guantanamo. Only the lawyers can talk to people who are currently there. So it feels like there's a real gulf between like me writing this book and you guys drawing it, and like we're writing about these people, but we can't actually talk to them. And so Shelby sent a pencil draft of the book to Abdul Latif, and it got through the censors and they were actually able to read it. And then she sent me back this note that he wrote. And so I got this last April, and I don't know if you can read it. It's a little hard to read, but he says, thanks. He says, first of all, thanks for meeting and talking with me. And then he said, I have really enjoyed reading your pages. And I'm actually not sure what that says. Regarding the comic book, I think it's a clever attempt for the author to draw attention to our suffering in a funny way. By the way, most people here look at the book and could hardly recognize your picture on the front page. So there's both I would say it's a mixed review from the guys. I definitely think it's clever, but we should make her look more like she does in real life. But that was, I was just like kind of teared up reading that letter because it felt like, oh, we've been able to bridge that gap, you know, that the government tries to keep between us, and to be able to actually like have people in the prison read about this book that we've made about them was really, really special. And I hope that they're able to get an actual copy of the book. Okay, that's all for our presentation, so we can take some questions. Okay, so one of the questions, and feel free to add more questions to that Q&A spot. One of the questions was, how do you organize your transcripts and research to pull up the info to draw a scene? That's a great question. So I do an interview with somebody, and then I go through the transcript and I highlight the sections that I think are best suited for a comic. And the good and bad thing about comics is they're super brief. And so you have to keep it as few words as possible, and think really from a visual storytelling perspective. What are the images and what are the visual scenes you're trying to convey, and keep as few words in there as possible and let the images do the talking. So I highlight everything in the script that I think I want from the transcript into the actual script. And then I actually just take that and start trying to lay it out as a narrative and cut from there. Do you guys, does anybody else have any advice on that? I know both Hazel and Kane do nonfiction comics. So how do you approach writing them?
I think it really depends so much on the story, where if you're trying to convey a lot of dense narrative information, then the pictures become more about either breaking up that information or, you know, more like infographic territory, versus something like this, where I think they're more about kind of humanizing and dramatizing the material. So it's yeah, nonfiction comics are so diverse in tone and visual style and so many other things.
In my own nonfiction comics, I tend to write excessively, and then I have to try to figure out what information could possibly be conveyed visually. So it's nice to be able to like slide the lettering around and the images too. So I'm thinking about like how much space is this lettering taking up on the page. But yeah, for me, it's like Sarah said, like, you know, cut, and like figure out, yeah, what could possibly be conveyed visually, even if it gives the reader a different kind of sense of the information than like reading a fact in a caption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to get to a point where I have no narration at all in a comic, like where it's no like third party narration, it's just the person talking is for me the ideal comic, or just people talking, or no words at all even. That would be great. But it's actually like having fewer words is actually more difficult to do. It's most people overwrite and then have to cut. Maybe that's like regular writing too, but especially with comics, you really notice it when I send a script to an artist and then they draw it and I'm like, oh no, I put way too many words in there, I need to cut them out. Someone asked if I have kept in touch with the former guard, Chris Arendt, and if they've seen the book. Yeah, Chris like very much has their own life in Michigan and is now a tattoo artist, which is cool. And we keep in touch on Facebook, and I sent them the PDF of the book before it was published, and they really liked it. They got great feedback. And you know, this was like a very difficult time in their life, so I was kind of worried that it would be like traumatic to read this, or that it's just like kind of dredging up like bad old memories. But they said it was really special to read, and so I just actually mailed off the hardback copy to them the other day. So yeah, a lot of this stuff is really, it's tough for people who live through it to talk about it and experience it again. So I always try and keep that in mind when talking to people who have either served at Guantanamo or who've been imprisoned there, that like, this isn't like easy stuff to talk about and share about. So especially when I'm doing interviews with them, or it just like interacting with them in any way, I don't expect like a rave review. You know, it's tough stuff. Okay, geez, we have a lot more questions. How was it to work with this content, and were you able to separate this work from your home life? Yeah, this is a good question for everybody, but I'll answer first and then you all can think of your answers. For me, yeah, it's really, really difficult. Last year when I was writing this book was pretty tough. Thinking about torture every day, thinking about basically like really dark stuff, and also just looking at like trying not to be hopeless about it, you know, like nobody who has done wrong at Guantanamo has faced accountability in any way. And in fact, actually like the people who okayed torture and who did commit torture there have been promoted and like have great jobs and have been honored. And the people who called out problems and tried to stop the process really got punished for it. And so, and then it's just like hard to be like, okay, how do you tell a story that feels like there's no end to it because it's ongoing and there's no real like moment of victory here, you know? I think in writing this book, people want like a snappy ending, or they want it to be like, and then the good guys won, or like there was a moment of like victory, and those are pretty rare here. So in writing it, I tried to like focus on whatever I could that were moments of like humanity and resilience, and bring those to the fore, so that it's not just like nonstop devastation in writing this. What about you, Omar? How do you deal with writing about really tough stuff?
So when I was writing the intro for this, I pulled out the folder that I had of all my files from that year I spent going back and forth to Gitmo. So 2008, I was back and forth, I think 8 or 9 times. And a lot of it was just the documents we would get, because we would go for pretrial hearings. So we would get the documents that were submitted to the court for those hearings. And one of the most amazing things about it is that the entirety of these documents were clearly written with no sense of them ever becoming part of the historical record. You know, you look at this stuff and it's very much intended to placate the now, to placate the moment they're in, whatever they need to do in that present moment. Because you look at this stuff in hindsight now and it's ridiculous. There was one court document where the defense lawyer attached an appendix to a defense motion, and the government censor went through and censored the hell out of this thing. Names, places, actions. There were some paragraphs where it was just the word "the," and then just black lines everywhere else. Thing is, this document that he'd appended was a copy of a New York Times article about the person he was defending. So I immediately got online, looked up the article, and could see exactly what it is the censor had decided was too dangerous for us to read. It was ludicrous, and yet nobody in the process, nobody along the chain of command said, "Hey, what the hell are we doing here?" You know, censoring a copy of an article from a newspaper, the most popular newspaper on earth. So that feels really resonant right now. This notion of everything that's happening now, all the public statement by the current administration, there is no sense of this ever becoming a part of history. It's just for now, and that feels to me like the central thing that came rushing back when I went back into the world of Gitmo was this notion of the past doesn't matter, the future doesn't matter, get us through this moment right now, whatever we need to say, whatever we need to do to get through it. And that was terrifying to sort of try and mentally contend with.
What about you, Hazel or Kane? Was drawing this stuff pretty emotional for you?
Yeah, it was. I think I tried to focus on the technical aspects. I think if I thought about it too much, it was difficult. And I think I had a lot of anxiety about respecting Mansour's experience. And so at a certain point, I think I just needed to kind of put one foot in front of the other and keep drawing, but it's difficult.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. And let's do the one that was voted the most, which is from Fiona, who's my agent, who sold this book. So thanks, Fiona. Because of you, we all were able to make this book. And you asked, is there anything that you wanted to include that you had to cut because of space? Yeah, a ton of stuff. I feel like each chapter in this book, when I originally wrote it out, was probably like twice as long as it is in the book. And a lot of what I had to cut was like what's happening like now. So a lot of this is like, this book is looking from 2002 to how we got to this point, but it's not talking about like ongoing trials that are like preparation for trials. The trials have not actually started, and who knows if they ever will, but like ongoing preparation for that, and the like many legal intrigues here, I think could be their own book, but they're so super complicated and honestly like not very good visuals that I just couldn't keep them in there. So there's like for example, an entire team of like defense lawyers quit because it turned out that there was like a microphone that the government had placed in one of their client attorney meeting rooms, and that's illegal. And so they quit in protest. And that's just like one story out of like 100 absolutely ridiculous legal stories about the like process of beginning to like the pretrial process that's happening at Guantanamo. And I basically just didn't include anything about that whole process because it's ever changing. Like what's happening now is not what was happening last year. The rules are extremely complicated and the people constantly change. And so it didn't feel like it was something that was really good to turn into a comic, you know. It'd be pretty tough. And then also like what I don't feel great about is that with Mozambique Beg is one of the former prisoners who's in this story, and his story ends when he's released from Guantanamo. It's like he's about to get out and then he's released, but actually him and everyone else who's been in the prison like has carried this trauma with them and has had like years and years of working through these experiences, trying to seek any kind of justice or accountability and like making a new life for themselves after prison. And that process is like spoken to in the book. People talk about it a little bit, but I think it would be, if I had more space, I would definitely do a story that just follows somebody after their release and how they're grappling with reality now. Yeah. Okay, we're kind of out of time, but is there anything else anybody wants to say? Feelings, thoughts, ideas?
I saw a question about how we got our fonts into the book, and so I just wanted to shout out that I made my hand lettering font with Calligrapher, which is a site. It's like Calligraph R, like Tumblr or something, and you can print out a sheet that's like a grid and write the lowercase and capital version of everything, scan it, and then I edited it with Font Forge, which is another free site. So that's how that gets done.
Cool.
Sarah, just in light of what you just said, Mansoor and I follow each other on Twitter now, and it's been interesting seeing him talk about dealing with COVID, that he's still very isolated in so-called free life, and that I think it's a really surreal experience to go from being forced into isolation by the state to being isolated the way that everyone is now.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thanks to Powell's for hosting. If you have any other questions, you are welcome to hit me up anytime on any social media platform. And I'll just share my screen one more time and put everyone's like handles up on the screen so you can see how to follow everybody. Ta-da. There it is. You can follow Hazel, Kane, Omar. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all your work on this book, and thanks for coming to this panel.
What an honor to be part of it.
Thank you so much.
I'm trying to give you guys an outro. Hold on, exit full screen. Okay, cool. So technical difficulties. I just want to thank you all for being here. Congratulations on the release of Guantánamo Voices. You can purchase it by going to powells.com. I left a link in the chat below or to the side, however your screen is set up. Yeah, it was a pleasure to host all of you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, everyone, for joining in tonight. And we look forward to seeing you at another one of our events again soon. Take care until then.
Bye.